The humanitarian crisis in Myanmar is just one of the concerns being discussed at the UN General Assembly. On day 2, President Trump addressed the threat of a nuclear North Korea, saying that if, quote, the righteous many don't confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. Stewart Patrick is a senior fellow for the Council on Foreign Relations, and he joins me now from Washington. So, Stewart, let's talk about President Trump's warning to, quote, totally destroy North Korea, to which he added that the U.S. would act alone if needed. Take us through the implications of that.
Well, it's an extraordinary statement to make in the United Nations General Assembly, an organization that's dedicated to peace. And I think it's only going to complicate the incredibly intense diplomacy that is going to have to go into resolving the North Korean nuclear problem. He may have felt he was placing pressure on Kim Jong-un, but I think the North Korean leader has taken the measure of Donald Trump and probably thinks that he's a paper tiger. He may also have been trying to put more pressure on the Chinese, but frankly, China's already done quite a bit, and they're not willing to use more of their leverage because they have a different set of priorities with respect to North Korea than we do.
Well, President Trump also called the Iranian nuclear deal negotiated under the Obama administration an embarrassment. And with much of the Security Council in support of the agreement, how do you see that playing out?
I see this as a really tough path for the president to go down. His own administration last week actually recertified the Iranian nuclear agreement, and the International Atomic Energy Agency is on record as saying that Iran is living up to this. So on what grounds does he possibly have to offer? Because the international community will not be happy, particularly European allies who are a lot closer to Iran than the United States is, if he suddenly pulls out of an agreement that everybody seems to think is actually working.
Another pressing issue on the foreign policy front, one UN official referred to the crisis in Myanmar as a, quote, textbook case of ethnic cleansing. What kind of response, Stewart, are you expecting from the international body in that regard?
Well, it's interesting that Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN himself, used to head the UN Refugee Agency for something along the lines of 8 years. And Nikki Haley also has talked about the humanitarian work that the UN does. And so I think that there's going to be a greater effort to try to focus attention on that. Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel Prize winner, who is the de facto head of state in Burma and Myanmar, she really has her reputation tarnished by this because she hasn't even acknowledged that it's going on. Something needs to be done, and hopefully the United States will lead on this.
I'm curious, why do you think there has been some reticence on the part of Aung San Suu Kyi to decry this more forcefully?
Well, in Rakhine State, where the Rohingya primarily are, I think that, there's been a conflict going on there, an internal conflict within Burma for a long time. And I think many of those in Myanmar see this as sort of an existential threat to the integrity of their country. And so she's under tremendous pressure, particularly from the generals who, of course, at the end of the day, wield all the power in that country.
Heartbreaking images coming out of that part of the world. Meantime, French President Emmanuel Macron criticized President Trump for his failure to address climate change in his speech Tuesday morning. Given what we have heard from the Trump administration regarding the Paris Climate Agreement, where does that deal stand?
Well, the deal is still going forward, and I think Emmanuel Macron and other leaders made that eminently clear the day after, or the day of, the Rose Garden speech, in which the president actually pulled the United States out of that, which was a very ill-considered move on many levels. But I think that it's hard for Donald Trump to come to the United Nations and ask for help in doing a lot of things that he has placed as priorities, for instance, the North Korean nuclear program, if he's leaving out or abandoning an effort along the lines of the Paris Accord to try to deal with what other countries think is the most serious long-term threat facing the planet. But the program is going to go on. The Paris Accord is going to continue, and a lot of U.S. states, California, New York, Washington, just several of them who are getting involved, as well as many cities, to try to make it a reality.
Finally, Stewart, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping are not in attendance at the United Nations. What does that say about the UN if the leaders of two key members of its Security Council are not at the General Assembly?
Well, it says a couple of things. One, it says that, the United Nations is not the only game in town, and there are other frameworks of cooperation that those countries might be as equally interested in. Obviously, for Vladimir Putin, it would have been diplomatically sensitive for him to come at a time when the Russia investigation under Robert Mueller is proceeding apace. For Xi Jinping, it's a little strange in some ways that he didn't come, in my view, because many people have said that as the United States makes itself more dispensable, if you will, at the United Nations, that vacuum is actually being filled by China. And even without Xi Jinping there, I think many countries are now beginning to look to China for leadership in a lot of different areas.
All right. Stewart Patrick, thanks so much for your insight, Stewart. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.